Okay, welcome everyone to today's speaker series. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge that even though we are now in the disembodied space of an online meeting, Lacan Salon is based in the traditional, unceded, stolen, and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, rightful owners and ancestral keepers of these territories and the cultures and traditions associated with them. As an immigrant from Mexico, I want to remind myself that indigenous cultures from the Arctic to Patagonia are alive today, resisting genocide and exclusion. I would like to take this opportunity to commit myself to the understanding of these cultures and to the struggle against the system of oppression that have dispossessed indigenous peoples of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination. Finally, I feel the need to recognize that colonialism and genocide are sadly not a thing of the past, and that as we speak here today, the people of Palestine are suffering the brutality of the state of Israel and its criminal accomplices. Sadly, they are not the only ones. Nevertheless, I introduce today's speaker with great enthusiasm because coming together and talking about loss and grief is one of the many things we need to resist in these difficult times and to build a better future. Mariana Hernández Urías practices psychoanalysis in Mexico City. She has a PhD in philosophy from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. She coordinated the book Pensar Ayotzinapa, published by Almadía and UNAM in 2018, and has several publications in collective books such as Psicoanálisis, Deconstrucción y Crítica de lo Psicopolítico, published by ACAL in 2021, and Luz Salomé, de las consecuencias de que no fuera la mujer quien matara al padre, published by Navarra in 2024, recently published. And she's currently working towards the publication of her work, Capitalism and Libidinal Economy, Mourning, Social Bond, Subjectivity, which is what she will discuss with us today. So she will present, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions and so on. So welcome, Mariana, welcome everyone.
Bienvenida, Mariana.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Hilda, particularly. Thank you, Juan Luis, for inviting me to share some of my work. I'm very excited. Okay. What I want to do today is a general mapping of the problems I'm addressing in this work. Disclaimer, I'm going to gloss over many points because there's just not enough time to delve into them, and some I'm just going to mention. So this is just a part of the work I did that I'm presenting. But if you find any of these interesting, maybe we can find some other occasion to discuss further, and at the end, of course, we can talk about some of these. So let's start because it's quite a lot. Let's start with capitalism, okay? I think talking about capitalism is challenging because we talk a lot about it, but we don't really know if we are understanding the same. Capitalism is rather a loose and shifting signifier. So I'll try to pinpoint what I'm referring to with capitalism. I started seriously thinking about it when the Ayotzinapa case occurred in Mexico. It's going to be 10 years this September, which is hard to believe. In short, what happened was that on the night of September 26, 2014, a group of students and civilians suffered a series of attacks that resulted in the death of 6 people. 3 of them were students, at least 40 people injured, and the enforced disappearance of 43 students from the Escuela Normal Raúl Isidro Burgos in Ayotzinapa. This all happened in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero. In Iguala, Guerrero, actually. These acts involve, it has been proven, these acts involve the participation of the municipal police, the state police, as well as elements of the army and the navy, all of them in collusion with an organized crime group, a group of narcotraficantes called Guerreros Unidos. These were young men between the ages of 17 and 25, starting to become rural teachers, who usually act as community leaders. These escuelas normales, these schools, are socialist schools. They are part of a social and socialist program promoted by then president in the late 30s, Lázaro Cárdenas. And there is a tradition of strong rebellious leaders coming from these schools. And this school in particular, the Ayotzinapa school, is in particular plays an important role in the history of political resistance in Mexico. Gradually, governments have closed down these schools and starved them with cutbacks. So by 2014, when this happened, the Ayotzinapa school had a budget of 50 pesos, which is around $4 Canadian, per student per day to cover every expense. 3 meals, education supplies, cleaning, operation, every expense. Students slept on mattresses that the government had supplied almost a decade before, or in pieces of foam rubber. And the building had never, where they studied and lived, had never been renovated since its construction in 1926. To say they live precariously would be an understatement. So why is it that these people trying to embody a strong political resistance are living under such precarious conditions? Is it just because these conditions are provided by the state and the state is not going to feed its own enemy? I think it's not just that. When I learned this, I couldn't stop asking myself, why weren't we protesting before? Weren't those living conditions expressing something about the value of those lives? Ushering something about what could happen? Why did we get it led to the point where violence was rampant? I think the same thing can be asked about Palestinians. This has been going on for over 70 years. Evictions, water and power cuts, mobility restrictions, walls and checkpoints, apartheid policies, arbitrary detentions, murders in small but constant numbers. It is until we are confronted with a spectacular violence that we are outraged. But the structural violence has been there for a while. And I'm afraid we can think of many more examples of this. I believe it's not exactly that we don't care. I think there's something entrenched in the system that works discreetly and smoothly to make us not notice. For me, it is impossible not to think at this point of what Judith Butler calls ungrievable lives. That is, lives that are not worth protecting, lives whose value is from the get-go nullified, so that when they are lost, there's no mourning, no grief to take place, no loss to be recognized nor inscribed politically and socially. Because this happens a lot. We encounter direct resistance, refusal to acknowledge that a loss has taken place, particularly from those in power, but not only. Thus, mourning, grieving, can be a strong political act of insurrection against a system that prescribes that some lives are just not worthy. We know under capitalism, value is distributed in a differentiated way, but it's not just monetary value. The commodity form is about much more. And here is where Marx's critique proves to be still fully valid. The solution he put forward is a whole other story, but the critique is very important, as is the elaboration of such critique by Georgi Lukács. And also I should note the work of Wendy Brown. They are all very important for this. I'm going to do just an outline, but I want to talk about this commodity form. The commodity form has been incorporated in almost every aspect of human life. This means that the fetishism of commodities has been socially incorporated. This fetishism that Marx sharply located and explained entails assigning to objects the attributes and value inherent of people, and simultaneously perceiving people as things. So it's humanizing merchandise and objectifying people. The key is that under capitalism, these go together. One cannot be without the other. This incorporation of the commodity form also implies the full adoption of the principle of calculability, which is a form of rationality, close in a way to technical rationality. It is a disposition to make an increasingly precise calculation of the results to be achieved and the process to be followed in order to achieve them. In this process, people are treated as parts of a mechanism. They are part of the calculation. Because you see, capitalism is not just the pursuit of wealth. It implies this specific type of rationality. Capitalism uses certain formal elements and treats time and force in a particular way to articulate the possibility of calculating the return that follows an investment. This calculation seeks to guarantee profit, but particularly to avoid loss of capital. Profit is only such if ultimately there is a surplus in relation to the capitalist's investment. Now, let us be clear. Incorporating the principle of calculability is not a matter of becoming highly rational subjects, but rather of approaching human activities as something in which we can, in a way, estimate the return that will result from an investment. This may regard knowledge, recognition, attention, even affection. So, beyond its historical developments, I'm arguing that an essential structural trait of capitalism is that it does not tolerate loss without compensation. Uncompensated loss seems terrifying. For example, during a financial crisis, the advice given to investors is not to sell their shares because it would effectively materialize the loss. So they should wait. Hence, we don't think in terms of loss. We think in terms of investment. I put something in order to get something from it. And by now, the investment profit form is imposed upon almost everything. Now, does this mean we manage to avoid loss? Almost a rhetorical question, but when asked about the political implications of his psychoanalytical research, Lacan answered, I'm quoting, "In any case, that there is no progress. What you gain on one side, you lose on the other. Since we don't know what we have lost, we think we have won." Indeed, we do not know what we lose because we are too focused on what we gain. And maybe also because under capitalism's form of valuation, we cannot recognize it. We cannot value it. So let me say right now, I believe psychoanalysis can have enormous emancipative effects as an experience, and also that it's a great conceptual tool to explain and give an account of the dominance mechanisms that take place for a body subject to be inscribed in a sexual system, a system that is always cultural and social as well as familiar. But even if it can be an invaluable tool for critique and even dismantling of such systems, it can also work exactly the other way around. So I think that in order to prevent psychoanalysis to operate under a normative and adaptational logic, or even as a justification for oppression, it is absolutely necessary to be aware of the political and ethical edge that is always at stake in writing, but especially in our practice. That is to say that there is no possible psychoanalysis from a neutral or pure position. The conformation of the subject is political. Family is not a bubble isolated from the social world. And perhaps the main idea from which I'm positioning this work is that we have no reason to think that the unconscious could be structured under an economy less immersed in power relations than the economy in which we move in everyday social life. So I'm proposing a parallel of libidinal economy and political economy. Okay, now, when addressing the question of subjective emancipation, I think the first thing we should ask ourselves is, which subject are we talking about? Who and what is this subject we pretend to emancipate and liberate? On this, I follow Foucault. I also follow Butler and Hegel and Lacan, but let's stay with Foucault, which means we are talking about a subject formed by power. Now, this not only means to break away from the classical subject of philosophy, the subject of knowledge, the one from Descartes and Kant, and to do so particularly regarding the political realm. Is not just that, because what Foucault proposes goes further. He is posing the productive characteristic of disciplinary power. I read this disciplinary power as deeply capitalist, not only because of the historical context from which it springs, but because of the way it uses time, space, and many dispositives in order to produce individuals that are both docile and useful. I don't have time to explore all of this, but that's one of the things we could eventually talk about. Now, this productivity means that power is not something external that executes its force on body subjects that were previously or already there, but rather that by subjecting bodies to discipline, it forms them. By subjecting individuals to certain processes, it produces them. The body subjects are both an object of discipline and its effect. Here, we encounter a double face to the subject. On the one hand, to be subjective, and on the other, to be an agent, to be capable of action. We are subjected to power. It is in many ways inflicted upon us along our lives, causing discontent most of the times. It subdues us, but it also sets the conditions for our existence and the possibilities to act. It frames our lives. Whether we like it or not, power channels the course of our desire. It sets what is desirable, worthy, valuable, valid, and what isn't. Foucault insisted in the fact that we tend to think of power as something negative, that is like a set of prohibitions, when actually power is positively productive. It produces reality, it produces objects, it produces rituals of truth, it produces criteria for normality, health, and functionality, and also for abnormality. But again, keep in mind that this is not something external. We don't choose the conditions of our existence, but we recognize ourselves in them. These conditions are imposed upon us, and yet we feel they belong to us. This leads us to desire the conditions of subjection and to reassert them over and over, because we want to persist in existence, even if it's under subordination. In part, that's why emancipation or liberation may seem as something directly threatening to the subject. I'd rather be subjective than not existing. So my idea of emancipation is not that there should be no law, nor that we should push for the dissolution of the subject. I'm not with Deleuze and Guattari on that. Rather, I aim to think on how to reconfigure the sociosymbolic field that supports the subject, that frames its possibility of agency and guides the trajectory of its desire. Subjection and subjectification are necessary to operate in the world. We need language, we need certain rules and conditions in order to be subjects. But that doesn't mean that we need these rules and conditions. Nonetheless, it's worth asking ourselves if that means there's nothing at stake, nothing to lose when pursuing emancipation. Now, Foucault does not explain how is it that we make these conditions our own in an intimate way. How is it that social rules become accepted, not in an intellectual way, but subjectively, emotionally, and ideologically? How do social rules turn into psychic norms? And here is where psychoanalysis becomes indispensable. Because the mechanism of identification is fundamental to understand the incorporation of social rules. Now, identification is a very complex psychic mechanism. And I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to try to do an outline, marking the points of Freud's journey in articulating identification, okay? Sí, I think I'm going to skip Lacan, pero ahorita vemos, we'll see. Let's go with Freud. At the beginning, identification is linked to the formation of the hysterical symptom, but this is blurry, okay? So the proper articulation starts in 1914 with the text on narcissism, an introduction. There, Freud proposes narcissism as a fundamental concept of the libido theory and seeks to explain the relations between the ego and the external objects. All of this in libidinal terms. He starts to outline the identification mechanism, and he poses the ego ideal and some psychic agency that would be watching, would be surveilling for narcissistic satisfactions. This is crucial because the ego ideal is presented as a hinge between the psychic and the social. It is associated to the moral conscious and it operates unconsciously. Okay. After that, a year later, 1915, in Mourning and Melancholia, one of the main articles we're going to talk about, he further elaborates on identification through the notions of incorporation, which is Abraham's concept, and introjection, Ferencz's concept. There's also reference to a critical judgmental agency, and identification is fundamentally linked to the loss of a loved object and to ambivalence, that is aggressiveness. This aggressiveness here is restricted to some cases like melancholia. But Freud locates the aggressive component to identification. This relates to the oral drive, which means to devour, to eat, and hence destroy. There is an insurmountable aggressive component to identification. Next up, group psychology and analysis of the ego in 1921. This is considered the work in which he presents the most comprehensive account of his theory of identification. Freud presents it as a mechanism entirely linked to the Oedipus complex, to the loss of the love object, and to ambivalence, which is now constitutive of every love bond. The ego ideal plays a very important role in love, in hypnosis, and in the cohesion of the group, of the mass. Later in 1923, in The Ego and the Id, Freud will fully depathologize the melancholic identification. Melancholia was presented at the beginning as a pathological mourning. Something went wrong for him. Now it's fully depathologized, this type of identification, which means an object cathesics is replaced by identification in order to preserve the lost object. I will go into detail about this a little further. This, says Freud in 1923, is something common and typical and essential for the formation of the ego and the ego ideal. All of this journey on articulating identification helps us understand that the authority of the ego ideal or the moral conscious is that we recognize it as our own. It is quite literally a part of us. It refers to something wider than being good or bad. It's social, and it's about what we value, what we consider important and even true. Freud calls it cultural and ethical representations. And he points out that repression takes place because individuals accept the normative character of those representations and submits to them. This is a crucial part of subjectivation. How we as subjects assume and appropriate certain conditions of existence when it means to subdue to them, accepting that submission. There is also a more explicit political scope to this in the relation between identification and the Freudian group, the mass, where everyone in the group shares the same ego ideal. This is what makes them come together and act as one, as an ego. And I think this relates to how identity works. Nationalities, gender, race, class, and other categories to which we feel we belong, and that gives us a sense of group identity. A strong sense of identity that is usually weaponized against others, used to segregate and even to exterminate others. I already mentioned there is an aggressive, insurmountable aggressive component in identification. It is represented in the formulations, the expressions such as, it's us against them. It's the good ones against the evil ones. It's the light against the darkness. This is a type of social bond. This is the most common social bond founded in identification. The question, of course, is, can we go beyond that type of social bond? Can we go beyond identification? Are there other possibilities? Now, what I'm presenting, this all seems to work smoothly, but actually there are many unclear aspects regarding narcissism and libidinal economy in the relation between the ego and the object. For example, what relates to the object, what goes to the ego, what is happening in paranoia, how does work love? It's it's really a bit of a mess, this libidinal theory. And Lacan notices this from a very early stage in his thesis when he's working on a case of paranoia, and he states that literally narcissism is a terra incognita, an unknown land for psychoanalysis. Lacan is going to propose a new identification theory by presenting his famous mirror stage in several writings, not just the one about the mirror stage. I think I'm going to skip that part because we won't have I'd rather talk with you about melancholia and mourning and Freud's take on that. But I'll just say a few things. While Freud focused on a vertical hierarchical identification, that is identification to the leader, identification to the father, Lacan takes upon horizontal identification with our peers, with the little other. And in his take, identification and the formation of the ego is not about inside relating to outside. It's rather about a constitutive relation to alterity. And under his perspective, it becomes much clearer the power dynamics that come into play in identification. This dialectic of domination and subjection, where of course his studies on Kojève's take on Hegel is very important. See, I'm going to skip on that. If there's time, we can talk at the end. Pero by now, I think you can see that even if the question of mourning is essential, I cannot address it without delving into the question of how the subject is formed. Not if I'm aiming at the political and almost ontological scope when considering loss as constitutive and mourning as a legitimate way of emancipation. Because in my work, I'm not trying to say, oh, when facing a loss, grieve like so and so, and then you'll be free. Rather, I'm trying to articulate how is loss a constitutive part of the subject, in which ways its refusal, the negation of loss, is so entrenched in us that it gives shape to the relationships we establish with ourselves and with others, and also to the way we approach identity. And I try to grasp how is loss such a hard, painful experience to face, although pain, grief, does not make it impassable. On the contrary. So let's talk about loss and libidinal economy. I already mentioned that there's a link between loss and identification in melancholia. Melancholy is a psychic process in which the ego, facing the loss of a loved object, unconsciously identifies with it precisely in an attempt not to lose it. I see in the melancholic libidinal economy a clear capitalistic disposition. Loss is intolerable. Freud characterizes melancholy as a pathologic or abnormal mourning process. This is a rare writing, mourning and melancholia, because Freud usually uses the pathologic to explain normality, thus making pathology and normality a matter of greater or lesser degree. But here, his baseline is normality, and this is his version of mourning. And it is rather unclear how he came up with this version. He presents it as a given. There's no critical perspective to mourning. He's just like, oh, we know mourning is like so and so. Now, according to Freud, the melancholy process goes as follows. There is a love attachment to an object, and the attachment gets disrupted. There has been a fight, some neglect, a disagreement, a disappointment, something happened. That disruptment of the attachment causes a loss. The expected reaction would be to detach and displace the libido to another object. That's what happens in mourning. But instead of that, libido returns to the ego and is used to establish an unconscious identification with the object. The crucial thing about this melancholic identification is that it is not a random psychic event. I already mentioned in group psychology and in The Ego and the Id, Freud directly links this identification to the formation of the ego and the ego ideal, as well as to the establishment of the dependent bond that subordinates the ego to the ego ideal. Hence, the key here is that this melancholic identification, once depathologized, is a subjectivizing mechanism. And this subjectivizing mechanism is triggered as a reaction of rejection to loss. This identification comes into place because the ego doesn't want to resign to lose the object. So identifies with it in order to preserve it. Two things are at stake in the melancholic identification. Object love, object cathexis, has been replaced by identification. This means object libido turns into narcissistic libido. Second, like identification, loss is unconscious. It is not clear what has been lost. Now, following Freud, the way out of melancholia is possible only if the subject becomes conscious of the loss. Such awareness would give way to a work of mourning that would allow the subject to process such a loss. In melancholia, the ego is subdued to the link, to the identificatory link to the lost object, and is trapped in a circuit where he doesn't know what he's doing. And he's just chasing this object, okay? The way to break free of that circuit is to become aware of the loss and start a mourning process, okay? The problem is there is only an apparent agreement on what it means to elaborate mourning and reach its end. So it's not clear how loss is processed. What do we do with loss? I examined 4 different versions. There is Freud's account on mourning, which we're going to visit today. There is also Abraham's and Melanie Klein's account. They both say they are following Freud, but actually they are presenting different versions. Although something relevant is that they both accept Freud's theory on loss as foundational. They follow this depathologized melancholic identification as formative. Abraham, I already mentioned it, developed the notion of incorporation, mainly to locate libidinal stages. And Klein, who, by the way, was Abraham's analysand, she did something amazing. She articulated the depressive position. And at least regarding this point, is sure Lacan establishes a critical dialogue with her. This is a very important reference for Lacan. The 4th version I examine in my work is the one I'm proposing. which is a critical mashup of Lacan and Butler. Lacan doesn't play melancholia in such a fundamental formative place. Instead, I think he detects a more general working, a kind of neurotic economy of desire. This is an economy where desire tirelessly chases a lost object, and it moves in a closed circuit, unable to break free, to change, to go after something different, which is very similar to Freud's account of melancholia, where libido is also trapped in a circuit. Also, Lacan doesn't have a morning account per se, but he touches important aspects of it in some sessions of his seminars, particularly when analyzing two cases where morning is at stake, Hamlet and Antigone. Antigone, right? Antigone. Butler, I believe, does have a morning theory of her own. She developed it over the course of the years of her work. There's a lot of inspiration from Klein, but I think she takes her implications further. And so I believe it is possible to establish a critical dialogue between Butler and Lacan. It is not complementary, but it is possible to establish a critical dialogue. Here we'll do only an overview of Freud's account of morning and an outline of some questionable aspects of it. So Freud presents morning as a work that has been carried out like this. Facing the loss of a loved object, the mourner will withdraw, not without reluctance, all libido from its attachments to that object. Following the order of reality testing, which has shown the loved object no longer exists, bit by bit, I quote Freud here, each single one of the memories and expectations in which the libido is bound to the object is brought up and hypercathected, and detachment of the libido is accomplished in respect of it. While this happens, the existence of the lost object is psychically prolonged. So when the work of mourning is completed, the libido is free again to be attached to a new object, referred by Freud in terms of, I'm quoting, substitute, and even in the Spanish version, in the Spanish translation, he talks about the replacement of the grieved one, el reemplazo del llorado. In English, he uses replacing him. This is precisely where normality lies for Freud. I'm quoting, a withdrawal of the libido from this object, the dead object, and a displacement of it onto a new one. This is what doesn't happen in melancholy. Instead of displacing the libido onto a new object, the libido goes back to the ego and is used to establish an identification with the lost object instead of replacing it. It's quite clear that the end and resolution of mourning from Freud's perspective is the substitution of the loved lost object. We would have to ask ourselves, what kind of object is replaceable? Because the object that Freud is presenting in Mourning and Melancholia is a very different object that he usually works with. The libidinal object is very different. But this solution of substitution sheds some light on why Freud insists on how mysterious is the painful nature of mourning. And I bring you some quotations. First of all of them from Mourning and Melancholia. Why this compromise by which the command of reality is carried out piecemeal piecemeal should be so extraordinarily painful is not at all easy to explain in terms of economics. It is remarkable that this painful unpleasure is taken as a matter of course by us. Another one. We should regard it as an appropriate comparison to call the mood of mourning a painful one. We shall probably see the justification for this when we are in a position to give a characterization of the economics of pain. There's another contemporary brief text called On Transience, where he states, however, we do not understand why this detachment of the libido, he's also talking about mourning and death. We do not understand why this detachment of the libido from its objects is such a painful process, and we cannot derive it from any assumption at present. We only see that the libido clings to its objects and does not want to give up the lost one, even when the replacement is ready. Another one. We know that sadness, as painful as it may be, ends spontaneously. When it has renounced all that has been lost, then it has consumed herself. And then our libido is freed again, insofar as we are still young and vital, to replace the lost objects with new ones, as precious or even more precious. It is to be hoped that the same will be true for the losses of this war. Sí. By talking about the withdrawal and displacement of the libido, Freud seems to point out at an abstract economic transaction where no loss is registered. By the last quotation, it's not only that no loss is registered, there's maybe even room for gain, as precious or more precious than the lost object. This is the perspective of a quantitative abstract economy. Marx would have to say a lot about it. Pain is not understandable from a point of view where people and loved ones are replaceable. And something worth noticing is that Freud revisited his melancholia version. He corrected it, he went over it, but he didn't go over the mourning theory he presented. He never revisited, he never corrected it, he never did anything about it, which is weird. Pero bueno, I think this mysterious pain is rather explained by this point of view where people and loved ones appear as replaceable. I recently learned that, you know that Freud family was very fond of dogs and they had several over the years. I recently learned that some of these dogs, beloved dogs, bore the same name. In the correspondence between Anna Freud and Eva Rosenfeld, there's Lune, it appears Lune, a Pekingese that gets run over and dies. And a couple of years later, Anna writes about Lune, another Lune, a new Lune. And Jana Lush points that apparently Hofi was another name used repeatedly. To gather lost loved objects under the same name is very telling on a series of using the same name. This is significant and problematic. But now consider this substitution as a resolution for the case of a mother who loses her child. Would we tell her, have another one? And what happens with political mournings? Are our Ayotzinapa students replaceable? Palestinians can be substituted? Grieving and honoring the children killed under the Canadian residential school system involves replacing them? There is a huge difference between what Freud poses and Lacan's approach in his seminar, Desire and its Interpretation, where he states that losing a loved one constitutes a ripping in the register of the real. And if something from the symbolic just register does not come to hold, to support the subject in mourning, and to honor the memory of the dead, that is, rituals to inscribe a loss, if that does not happen, then something of the order of psychosis may appear. This is a phenomenon happening for the mothers of the disappearing people in Mexico. It's not that they dream of the voices of their loved ones, or they dream about them. It's that they hear them asking for help. They hear them. It's a hallucination. Lacan is pointing out to that. Did you notice Freud does not refer to any rituals at all? Even considering his interest on anthropology. About mourning seems to be a private, internal, abstract process, a work. Freud is so caught up with his metapsychology that he doesn't consider, for example, to frame the loss of a loved one as a trauma, which would have a very different outcome. Instead, he delivers an account from the perspective of an abstract, quantitative economy, where the object gets replaced and no loss is registered in the end. Loss gets averted. Does this mean that loss must be refused? Is it possible to establish a relation with loss other than which capitalism seems to impose on us? We'd still have to hear what Abraham and Klein and Lacan and Butler have to say, but there's no time today. So we're going to stop here and we can talk about it if you'd like.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for a rich and rigorous and thought-provoking presentation, and a little bit anxiety-provoking, at least for me as well, I have to say.
Good.
So, well, let's open the floor and see. Oh, Hilda already has a question. So, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mariana. It was amazing kind of overview about the different approaches to kind of mourning and melancholia. I have worked also a lot about the theme through different perspectives, through the discourse kind of analysis, the psychoanalytic Lacanian discourse analysis, and sort of when I was listening to you about this kind of capitalistic logic, we have to also bring into the salad the fact that the surplus value is exactly the same structural sort of model of surplus jouissance, isn't it? Like Lacan says this in seminar, well, in radiophony very clearly, but it is working it through seminar 16, seminar 17. So the issue is, it's not so much that we can sort of choose, but the discourse chooses us already. Because, you know, like I have been working particularly around something that happened in the Lacan Salon recently, and that we are going to work through in the board, in the people that participate. But it has to do with how this discourse does. You don't choose the discourse beforehand. You encounter the discourse. You encounter the place of the loss, because in discourse, in social bonding, there's a specific space. No, remember the formulas. A specific space for the loss, unrecognized, because it is a surplus. As you said very well, it like the loss is intolerable. like in both systems, the system of human jouissance and the system of capitalistic model. So there's a refusal of the loss, no? So, but there's a place that surplus jouissance, a place of residue where the discourse puts everything. And then the thing is that, are we allowing the discourse, like, you know, the place of loss to go unwritten, to go unacknowledged? No, I think that's the life that I see in your proposal, right? Like it's this invitation. I mean, you didn't talk about, maybe you can talk as a response a little bit about the proposals from Lacan, Butler, and Braham, like how they propose that place of loss, what to do if not replacement, as kind of Freud proposed, which I always think that he was talking about the libidinal object, no? Like it's not so much like one son for another son, but rather one poem for a son. It's another way of investing in a libidinal object, no? But anyways, so I'm always a little bit like kind of more, for me, Freud opens more than closes in general, but not always. But anyways, going back to the place of the loss in discourse, right? Like Lacan is signaling, and maybe you are going to mention that for the need of inscribing the loss, right? Like inscribing the loss in the sense that it requires to be acknowledged, no? Like yes, like there's something that hasn't that left a bigger hole within, no? But what of that can be inscribed so it doesn't retake in the absolute maddening process of surplus jouissance, right? Like when a loss is not kind of acknowledged, it wants to keep going, right? Is this the craziness of the surplus jouissance, surplus value, no? And that something that you said that was very, very clear and very important is how the ego, because you were kind of playing between the two sort of positions that of the individual or whatever, subjective and the social, right? Like you were, you know, trying to put these things together. But how the rejection to loss is what gives life to the ego. I thought that was beautiful, beautiful. So anyways, after all these things, my point is like that place of loss in discourse, in social bonding has a place, but is not recognized. It's ignored, no? It's hidden, because Lacan says the theory of discourse is about finding the causes of the loss in a way, right? Like the causes of the loss, what is happening right now in the world, as you kind of mentioned, right? Like is it about recovering that loss to sort of show how that keeps structuring discourses, keeps structuring social bonding, no? How to do with that loss, right? That is already assigned a place in social bonding, a place of residue, like ignoring it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. What I try to argue about, I don't know if I understood the question. Let me know if I did, if I didn't. But what I try to argue is that the most common social bond in which we operate is founded in identification. And this means that there is this constant refusal of loss and this dominant seeking and feeling subjective. And I don't know how to say this in English, if you would please help me out, pero padecer, Lacan says, we rather suffer, we rather suffer la interdiction.
Interdiction. Yes, the interdiction. We'd rather suffer the interdiction
than facing castration. Okay, so and what I try to argue in this in this journey about explaining how subjection works via identification is that this identification is always a refusal of loss. So in order to go past identification, loss has to be acknowledged, and castration plays a role in that. Because one of the things that I'm thinking in this work is not just this parallel of subjectivity and social political realm, but also why is it that Lacan insists over and over in not putting identification to the analyst as the end of a didactic analysis? Why is it that he opposes identification so strongly? And I think it's about refusing loss. I think what becomes even when I really synthesize a lot the critique of Freud, because we would have to talk about that object that is replaceable, which is a fetish. And fetishism comes for the lack of phallus, for the absence of the phallus in the mother, right? So castration is at stake all the time, and castration is a menace for narcissism. So what I'm trying to argue is that. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, it gives food for thought. But so is there, like, let's say, are there ways of being with others, like, you know, social bonding that is not traversed by identification?
I believe so. I want to believe so.
There's not only identification of sort of imaginary level, no? Like there are identifications that come from identifying a discourse. For example, let's say, like, how do you imagine?
Symbolic?
Yeah, let's say, like, kind of obviously the ideal is always a little bit of an imaginary. I'm just thinking if there are other ways of being with others completely outside of identification, is what I mean. Like identification, it's kind of it's part of being humans, no?
Sí, you're right. No, and I wanted to I wrote that in the identification part of Lacan's work. It's not that identification or narcissism is something bad, is part of subjectivity. It's just my aim is to try to construct bonds, social bonds and communities where there's a little of resistance, where the rules don't, or the association doesn't work, like pushing for identification.
That sounds really clear to me. Yeah. It's that total different. Because identifications exist.
Is there, and it's not bad. It's not bad. It's very necessary for a lot of parts of subjectivity, for body image, for it's fundamental.
For the enjoyment to be with others. Yeah.
Sí. But one has to be aware of all that aggressive component, of all that violence it can unleash, and trying to put a little como contener.
Yeah. Totally. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. That was great. Anyone else would care to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, well, I have two comments. One is very short. The other one might be a little bit long, and I hope you can engage to both of them, Mariana. The first one is just an example that can be useful for us to think about. What you talked at the very beginning of your presentation, when you say how power conforms subjectivities, and how rituals are very important. And it's very telling that Freud just seems not to care about rituals. I'm thinking about two specific rituals that seem to have occurred in ancient Greece. The first one is an interdiction of women of publicly mourning their sons when they died at war. If they died of other causes, they could publicly mourn. But if they died at war, it was forbidden to them to be seen crying. And the explanation was pretty clear that would probably prevent other women, other mothers, to offer their own sons as sacrifice, as a Holocaust, in the name of the city-state. So it is very clear how patriarchal power would set a moment of mourning. It's not only which lives should be mourned, but also how we are allowed to mourn them. And the second ritual, which I just found out about it, I found it so beautiful. It is sort of a response to this interdiction. Women developed a subversive sort of festival that was absolutely feminine. It was only allowed for women to participate. And it happened on the rooftops. That is outside of the public gaze, outside of the masculine power control. And it was a festival of equality. It was the only festival in which slave women could participate. And it was a festival of death regarding surplus. Women who were in charge of gardening would create small gardens outside of the proper time to do so, because it would they would die. These plants would not yield wealth. They were destined to die. So it was a way of destroying a certain portion of surplus, but also a way of escaping this grasp of power that would dictate how they could deal with death. So I think these two rituals, one from power and one from subversion, are very important or very rich for us to think about these things. And the other comment, Mariana, I've already discussed this a little bit with you before, but I'd like to insist, because it insists in me. Because I've encountered both the argument from people who oppose change, and the same argument in the form of despair from people who would aspire to change but find it impossible. Which is capitalism is only the manifestation of human nature.
I knew you were going to ask that. I knew it.
Because for Freud, this rejection of laws that you talked about is natural, because it is seated on the anatomical differences between the sexes. So the attachment between the mother and the baby is, for Freud, natural and set on the anatomical differences. So it is natural that we reject laws. We do not want to deal with laws, and we naturally, in one of the quotes you recovered from Freud, he says he ascribes will to libido. He says libido does not want to, etc. So it is as natural as 19th century laws of nature can get. For Lacan, in contrast, it is unnatural, precisely because it comes from the disruption of nature that results from the signifier capturing the body and thus producing the real. So this radical difference of approach between Freud and Lacan opens for me a possibility different, again, as you mentioned, different from Deleuze and Guattari's opening, a Lacanian opening, to say, no, it is not natural. It is only natural in the sense of how Marx treats nature, as the nature of capitalism So within capitalism, it is unescapable, and it seems so natural that it's normalized, and we believe, yes, well, this is the way we are. We reject laws. We are mean. We are egoist, and so on, so on. But if we read this rejection of laws from the Lacanian theory of signifiers instead of the Freudian theory of anatomical differences, there is an opening which I think goes in the sense of what you work as emancipation, which I think is the most potent part of your work, which is grieving as a form of emancipation. And that is, I believe, really potent, really beautiful. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this.
Thank you for your question. I thought you were going to ask something a little bit different. Because we have discussed this, yes, this question of how can we know if this aversion to rejection of loss is not just natural or spontaneous, and that's why capitalism suits us very well. No, how do we know it's not the other? It's not the other way around. I think we cannot know. First of all, I'll answer my own formulation of the question. I think we do not know. We cannot know, but it is a political position to adopt some epistemological position. No, if there is a human nature or not, that is epistemological and is political. Because if we believe in human nature, we think we are positioning ourselves from a neutral, objective, scientific place where there is no political involved, but at the same time we are justifying certain forms of certain policies, no? Entonces, I think I take as a political stance and this epistemological stance where I think capitalism produces subjects, not as pero in this complex way, no? It's not that these evil men figure out capitalism and they are imposing it upon us, but that it's rather more complex. It's part of us. It constitutes us. It produces us. However, I think most of the work I read when doing this research was more of a pragmatic approach to this rejection of loss, more of this rational rejection of loss, and I try to explore the emotional aspect of this rejection to loss. Why is it painful, and how that same grief can be emancipative? That's why I try to insist in how there is something to lose when pursuing emancipation. It's not something you directly want. It's something threatening, because all the first part of this research on how identification is so effective is like, what are we so afraid to lose? What is it that we are gaining from staying subdued? Because there is some gain there, right? And it's not profit, it's love. That is love, and Foucault points out, but he touches this and he just moves on, no? And there are a lot of works where the author, usually male authors, bueno, most authors are male, pero it's telling that most of the times is these guys who are touching the subject of love, of pain, of sorrow, and they just como staying back, no? Como taking a step back. And Foucault says that in all the rule books of schools and institutes that he researched for articulating disciplinary power, he found out a lot of the times this instruction for the teachers and the directors and the authority figures to try to make their students love them and want to be recognized by them. Like, skip the punishments. Punishments are not as effective. Make them want to please you. And that is the most effective power, is the strategy.
Disciplinary power. Mm-hmm.
See, like, make them want to subdue. Make them want to be good. So I was wondering, what does this mean? No, but you want to be loved. That's what is at stake. What do you want? To belong. Identity is powerful because you want to belong. Mm-hmm. So you want to be a part of something. I was going to say another thing, and which is see, of course, this thing, and you and in the part of the morning theories, Freud is talking from this really abstract quantitative economy that he did not revisit it, because later on his trajectory he becomes a lot more qualitative and complex, right? And in the economic problem of masochism, he's asking himself about this same question: what is the economics of pain? What is going on here? No, but he cannot solve it, and Abraham cannot solve it, and it is until Melanie Klein brilliantly asks about how did the object came to be loved. Why is it that, because Freud says only if you love the object will it trigger this mourning response. If you don't love the object, if the object is not important, is not charged, libidinally charged, then there's no love, there's no mourning, there's no melancholy, there's no nothing. So Klein says, oh, okay. So only when the object becomes loved as a whole can its loss be lived as a whole, be felt as a whole. And she sets this really rich, complex, emotional account of what goes on both in love and in grieving, and how it is really subjectively conforming of everyone. And it's crucial to feel guilt, to feel fear for the destruction of the object, to feel afraid of one's own aggressiveness, and to want to destroy the object, and to want to incorporate it, but also to want to protect it. And all this ambiguity and complexity, but it's all emotional. And how love is not just to attach empty libido to an object, but to want to protect it from oneself.
Yeah.
And I think that's importantissimo. So important, so important. That's why I think Lacan, Melanie Klein was a very important influence in Lacan. Even when he a lot of times says like, oh, she was wrong about this and she was wrong about that, but she did a very important work there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also goes back to the very Spinozian argument you made, where everything strives to preserve itself. It's the conatus argument. And I think what Spinoza misses is precisely all this dimension of the death drive, and I think actually decolonizing Spinoza would be a funny but very productive exercise, because it would allow to introduce there in the conatus argument the dimension of transformation, which is of course a very important category in the practice of psychoanalysis, because even if we concede that everything strives to preserve its own existence by all means, only the acceptance of death, I don't know if it would be the colonizing and feminization of Spinoza. Only the acceptance of death would bring the possibility of incorporating transformation into that argument. And I think that is a very important category for psychoanalysis and subjectivity.
One thing I think I didn't mention is that this work takes a lot from the setting of circumstances that Judith Butler articulates in The Psychic Life of Power, in her book, The Psychic Life of Power. And there she takes on this Spinozian point of view where life wants to persist, so the subject wants to persist, and the main conflict is to stay alive, no? I don't take up on that because I take up on loss and affection, and this emotional aspect. Entonces, the question, of course, is what do we have to be willing to lose in order to emancipate? And that's where castration comes into place. You have to lose something. It's not just accepting what you already lost. You have to put also something.
Your pound of flesh.
See. Precisely.
Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thank you.
Hilda again has her hand up.
Yeah, but only if there's no other questions, because I want also to hear other people. Yeah, I just want to say
I would like that too.
Sure, yeah, I can ask a question.
Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Mariana for a great talk. I just really like the method of kind of jumping around between different psychoanalytic theories rather than just sticking to one. So yeah, I really like just the structure of the talk. Yeah, and I was just wondering, this is kind of just a basic question for comprehension. So when you're talking about loss, whether it's social or whether it's kind of singular. So like whether it's something like something where it's like kind of structural, and I think, yeah, I do see like just in ways where it could be structural, it could be social. Like right now, even we're doing this through Zoom, so there's like a loss of enjoyment of meeting in reality. Or is it kind of more singular? So like something that's specific to an individual, because yeah, I think these two are different in terms of how we can approach the problem.
See, it is an important question because I try to do a mirroring between, maybe it would be like 3 dimensions, where there is a constitutive loss that would be more than common to every subject. It would be like from the structure of the structure of the subject. And there are also like singular grievings, singular mournings, singular losses, for example, that we can encounter in our clinic, in our practice. And there are political mournings, which maybe are not felt as a singular loss, but I try to frame them as collective losses. But those singular losses for an individual require community as well. I argue with, for example, with Freud by not talking about these rituals, community rituals, to even if mourning, if grievance is a very, very lonely place, I believe, it is absolutely necessary to try to acompañar, how do you say that? To accompany each other. If, for example, if a family loses one member of the family, if one member of the family dies, every member of this family will experience a different loss, a very private, singular loss, not private, singular loss. But and even if that's something very intimate for each one of them, there has to be a way of giving companionship and this bonding with each other through mourning, which I think is something that capitalism and neoliberalism mindsets take away from us, because they push for loneliness a lot and selfishness, and that has effects on how we grieve.
No time to grieve.
No time to grieve. Time is mourning. No, pero sí.
Okay.
And I think I try to think of the three losses: a structural one, constitutive for the subject; the losses, the mournings we face in life, each and one of us; and the political ones, which are also difficult to articulate, because, for example, in the Ayotzinapa case, for some people it was evident, it was a problem, and it was a social mourning that we were facing, and other people even said stuff like, we're better off, they had it coming, that there's no loss at all. Entonces, that is also worth thinking, how to socially and politically grieve when these type of things happen, so that eventually, if we accept that we are losing something important there, that those lives are grievable, that those lives are worthy, then maybe we can push for policies to be instituted for more and more lives to be grievable and worthy and protected. Because sometimes it's okay not wanting to lose.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't you go, Hilda, and maybe someone else
It's thanks a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's kind of very rich, this conversation about the rituals and the kind of social bonding of kind of giving each other companion, for sure. But something that probably I wanted to highlight since the beginning, and kind of because it's a matter of something abstract in a way. I mean, the libidinal economy, it's being studied. It's interesting how ideas kind of permeate in different kind of regions, in different communities that are studying, well, human suffering, psychoanalytically speaking. I have kind of find a lot of companionship with regards to the libidinal economy in Zizek and in Samo Tomczyk, Alenka Stupancic, Ilan Kapoor, geographer, kind of. So what I wanted to say, and that's kind of my main point, I just wanted to say, is that it's not a matter of will, right? Like the way in singular kind of subjective suffering is not a matter of will. I'm going to decide to do this. It's just that the structure of language, it falls on us and forces, regardless of our intentions and our very good hearts or whatever, we are caught in certain ways of exchanging that privileges certain identifications that are phallic, yes, and that are kind of rejecting of the losses and the subjectivity. So, and understood subjectivity as the lack, right? So I was thinking, what I wanted to say is that the mode of analytic discourse is not that it's only the analytic in the clinic, but the analytic discourse that can take the loss to organize, like, for example, the mourning people that are kind of taking the loss as a way of organizing for, like, for a ritual, for having dinner, for doing the funeral together, for making the celebrations in honor of the person. So those things are kind of encountered by the contingencies, as you mentioned, these kind of accidental things that happen in people's life. But it's not a given, right? It's something that we have to stop and see it, that is happening, because otherwise we just keep repeating, because the structure of language forces us to repeat. No, it's the structure that is so thick. No, yeah, just I wanted to kind of pinpoint at that.
No, see, it's important because there's always this temptation of thinking that it's a matter of will, that you just have to declare it, ¿no? Como, I'm going to do this from now on. Hoy voy a cambiar, ¿no?
Get your shit together. Okay, we still have a little bit of time. So if anyone else wants to comment or make a question. Yeah, Estefanía.
Oigan, la voy a
Great
hacer
to see you.
Lo siento. Hola, hola, Juan Luis, hola, hola, Ida.
Hola, Estefanía. Sí, te traducimos, hablo en español y te traducimos.
Estaba pensando en lo que decías de la... Bueno, muchas gracias por la conferencia, Mariana. De verdad me hace pensar y me interpela mucho, pues no solo por lo que Juan Luis enunció al inicio de la sesión, sino también por lo que tú trajiste sobre desde las desapariciones en Ayotzinapa hasta lo que sucede en Palestina. Me interpela desde ahí y pues me conmueve mucho que puedan hacer este entrecruce entre psicoanálisis y un pensamiento en contra de los genocidios y desapariciones. Y quería preguntarte, en relación a la pérdida, ¿cuál sería tu perspectiva sobre los movimientos sociales o las solidaridades colectivas que nos unimos hacia un duelo y al mismo tiempo hacia una demanda social de que paren, por ejemplo, el genocidio en Palestina? ¿Cuál sería tu perspectiva o tu opinión sobre qué sería lo que tendríamos que perder ahí o qué estaría en juego como pérdida ahí, pensando en que no nos guiemos solo por la economía del ganar, ¿no? Como señalabas. No sé si mi pregunta está bien formulada, pero como que desde ahí es que a mí me resonó esta cuestión del el aprender a perder, ¿no? O el salir también de la lógica de la ganancia.
Well, just I want to acknowledge Hilda's magical skills to translate as Stefania was speaking. Just a little bit, one thing to add to what Hilda translated. Stefania is asking also in regards to the collectives that organize to fight or to resist these logics of genocide, destruction, exclusion, and so on. What would be there to lose in order to oppose this logic of capitalistic economy in gain? Thank you, Hilda, and thank you, Stefania.
I will answer in English. Is okay? A ver, it's a good question. It's a very complex question. I think it works in. A ver, well, first of all, I don't know. I don't have like the answer. I'll just tell you what I think about it. I think it can work in different levels. I think I see a lot of actions that are organized from sharing, like we're going to meet at this spot and we're going to make, for example, I recently knew about this collective action that I think it's very beautiful. I want to participate if I can. We're going to meet in front of the Museo Tamayo, and we're going to every one of us is going to bring food and water to share, and materials to saw to create poppies, and to plant them with fabric and with beads and with this material, and make poppies and plant them in front of the museum. And we want to take the flower of Palestine and cover as much ground as we can, because we want to create something beautiful, and we want to we want to create, no? So it's small losses, small gestures, where you want to put just to create something, and not to ask for something, and not like a protest can also be just putting something out there, and something lively, and sharing food and water and resources. I also believe that there is risk in digital protesting, because there is a lot of autocomplacencia. How do you say autocomplacencia? Like
self-complacency.
Self-complacency, like patting yourself in the back, like, oh,
self-indulgence. Yeah,
self-indulgence. I am such a good person. I'm just posting this, and this is horrible. And that's just like a self-reassurance of, I'm one of the good guys. Those are the bad guys, right? Another important thing that is unpopular and that is extremely, extremely difficult is to always stay aware of that the bad guys are also vulnerable and coming from a different and difficult place, and that they are, I don't like this terminology, but I cannot think right now on in something different to say, but that they are also human, that they also are, that's why I say they are also vulnerable, and that they are caught up in this imaginary reaction and movement, and they are the good ones, and they are the light, and they are, and it's really hard not to enter that game and say, no, you are the bad guys and we are the good ones, and enter this logic where everyone wants just to be good and right. And I think that's a lot to lose, to be able to stay in, to hold a position where you're not caught up with this self-righteousness. I think that's very difficult. But I also think it's very important. That's all I can say.
Gracias.
Can I say something to that effect? Because, Mariana, your research is very, very close to my research in terms of trauma, right? Like loss, trauma. And When I was asking these questions that Estefania posed about, what to do collectively with the loss, right? What to do collectively with this disruption of the, the real. I was working on trauma, no? This rupture of the real in collective ways. And I think that one element that is important structurally is the inscription in the sense of making legible such laws, right? For example, I was putting the examples of restitutive justice, no? Like something that is recognized, like the loss that is lost, right? But that there's some sort of, for example, for people who have, that is not going to bring the loss for sure, but there's some politically some awareness by the state that there's something that needs to be, like, from an apology that, there are empty apologies and there are full apologies, the restitutive justice, something, or the creation of laws that prevent those things to happen, those things that make the laws legible collectively. I think structurally is important. And there's Noemi. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Noemi.
Okay, I'm gonna try to ask in English, but maybe I switch very soon at Spanish. Okay.
Go ahead.
I was thinking about I don't know. I heard very bueno, escucho continuamente como que el duelo tiene un tiempo. People think maybe with in this capitalist times and neoliberal times that the mourning had finished in 1 year, 2 years. It depends that how big is the loss. If we can maybe, o sea, si pudiéramos tener una balanza para saber cuáles son las personas, cosas, situaciones que importan y su equivalencia. Bueno, si pierdes un trabajo, el duelo tiene que ser breve. Si ya duró más de 2 años, entonces hay algo ahí patológico, ¿no? Pero pensaba cómo también el tiempo acerca del duelo, o sea, no solo qué se puede duelar o esto de no hay tiempo para llorar, sino también el tiempo del duelo está tomado por el neoliberalismo. Porque si algo, como dice Mariana, o sea, si tenemos que aceptar la pérdida es para siempre, dura para siempre. O sea, el duelo tiene sus idas y venidas, pero creo que sí también es muy importante este tipo de conversatorios, este tipo de concienciación, para evitar pensar que, pues eso, que tiene un punto final. Y también pensaba, y esto solo como palabras ahí, el papel que también tiene, o sea, si bien no hay tiempo para el duelo, no hay tiempo para el dolor, y algo que se pierde, pues puede regresar en forma de recuerdo, también el papel del olvido, ¿no? En este sentido, es como para poder avanzar, volver a engancharse con otras cosas en la vida. Entonces, bueno, o sea, como 3 tópicos, no hay como una elaboración, una idea, pero pensar en los tiempos del duelo, sobre todo a la luz del neoliberalismo, y pensar también en el papel del olvido. Si bien no es que no perdemos, sino que pues, a veces olvidamos para poder continuar la vida, pues sí, ¿qué papel o desde dónde se podría pensar el olvido en la teoría psicoanalítica? ¿Y cómo lo pensaría?
So her question is how we can think the role of forgetting, like just in the last question she made, is to think on the role of forgetting in psychoanalysis. And there's some other things that both Juan Luis and I put, Mariana.
Sí. Freud asks himself in several times, or a few times at least, on the duration of the morning process. Because I think since he's like thinking of morning as a work, directly as a work, and gives very specific characteristics to this state of morning, like, for example, not being productive and not being able to focus and to move in the world and to work. He wonders, how long does it take? And since he describes this process as like detaching, like removing libido from one object and being able to place it onto another, this seems like a very mechanical process, no? Like it would have a set duration, and he wonders, why is it that we cannot know this duration? Why cannot we set it? And he says sometimes it seems like this morning is already done, and some memory comes up, something happens, and memory comes up, and this attachment is reavivado, no? It's like reactivated. Melanie Klein also thinks of steps and aspects of this morning process and how someone can resolve it. I think Lacan definitely thinks that there is an end to morning. Butler thinks there is no end to morning. It is a very important question, because if there is no end to morning, you would stay in a melancholic place, right? In a melancholic position. So, but the delicate thing is, love lasts forever. What does it mean that morning reaches an end? That is a crucial question, because for Freud, morning ends when you get a new object. Not that you love someone else, not that you get a new object that replaces the lost one. That is the crucial thing. That is the problematic thing. You have one lune, and then you have another lune. That is the issue. I think the question in Lacan is more like, how does desire stop chasing the same lost object over and over and over again? How can it just break free? How can we make desire como mobile, no? Like flexible and free.
Fluid.
Fluid, I cannot answer it in short. I think it's a very important question. Again, the setup of Freud's morning is very problematic. Pero as like Hilda said, it allows us to pose a lot of questions, right? Because Freud says reality testing shows the object no longer exists. So one has to follow the order of such reality and let go of that object. While this happens, the object persists psychically. What, when morning ends, you forget about the object and it disappears? No, it doesn't. How does that work, right? Abraham, for example, says he's following Freud, and the resolution is you will have the object forever within you as a memory. My dead one is always with me. There is no loss there. It will be always with me. So I find that as another capitalistic resolution of mourning. You preserve the object. So the question is, what do you have to lose in order for mourning to end and desire to break free? It's a very complex question.
And I think, I'm sorry, I wish I didn't interrupt you.
No.
I think memorizing, it's maybe different that conserves the object. Maybe memorizing or some kinds of thinking about the memorizing, because even in the social losses, like Ayotzinapa, the Palestinian genocide, we have to memorize, not that it is happened today. Even when it happened very in the past, I don't know how to say. So maybe memorizing, it's very different that the capitalized answer. I don't know, but maybe.
That's where I think of rituals as conmemorar and rememorar, honor the memory of the dead, and to cuidar, no, to care of that, to take care of that memory, and inscribe what was that life that was lost, and give a place to that hole made by that loss. That does, I personally try to articulate why there is a difference between that rememoración and conmemoración, that honoring and inscribing the loss, between that and now I will carry the object always with me, as Abraham portrays it, articulates it.
Oh, thank you, Noemi, for this last couple of questions. They were great. I think all questions and comments were really, really interesting. And I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially Mariana for a great presentation. I do hope that we have the opportunity to talk to you again, maybe even that you can come here and we can organize a seminar or something to further discuss this very, very important and potent work that you're doing. And I hope that you publish it and that there is an English translation so that we can discuss it further here in Vancouver as well. So thank you, everyone, and see you next time. And be sure to go to lacansalon.com to see our future events. We have more speaker series and talks with Corpo Freudiano, and our regular readings and discussions of Lacan seminar. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Juan Luis.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mariana.
Bueno, pues,
Muchas
abracitos.
gracias.
Oh, con
Vemos
mucho
pronto, Mariana.
cariño.
Muchas gracias.
Con mucho cariño. Estuvo súper bien.
Estuvo
Súper
muy
bien.
chido. Les agradezco mucho.
No, y tu inglés, perfecto.
Bueno.
Lista para venir a dar un seminario acá.
Eso. Bueno.
Bueno,
Un abrazote.
Nos vemos la
bonito
próxima.
sábado, descansen.
Igual. Chao.
Ya no, ya, solamente decía aquí a Eric que thanks so much. Sorry I wasn't able to hear the talk, but the conversation was wonderful. Okay. Bueno, nos vemos. Chao, chao.
Beautiful Sunday, Saturday.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.